Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable persistence of medieval mysteries. Stories once dismissed as legend, conspiracy, or drunken monk exaggeration, now unraveling under the cold, quiet gaze of modern science. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Lincoln Cathedral, that grand Gothic pile where medieval England tried its absolute best to impress God with flying buttresses, stained glass and stonework so dramatic, it might have been designed by a stressed-out theatre kid with a chisel. In the 1960s, beneath this architectural flex, archaeologists unearthed a skeleton. Naturally, everyone assumed it was a monk, because what else would a dead guy be doing under a medieval cathedral? Yoga. Except this one was all wrong. No robes, no sacred trinkets, no dramatic arms crossed in holy resignation pose. He looked less like Brother Gregory and more like Steve, who got lost on the way to Canterbury. He was buried face down with the haphazard grace of someone hidden during a panic, which in medieval England could mean anything from heresy to sneezing too close to the bishop. And then science got involved, specifically isotope analysis, aka bone T reading. Turns out our mystery skeleton wasn't local at all. He was Scandinavian, which explained the sturdy bones, worn knees, and the faint echo of longboat chants when the wind blew through the crypt. This guy was a pilgrim, not a monk. He had walked, yes, walked, all the way from Northern Europe, probably hoping for a miracle, or at least a decent relic. He ended up collapsing somewhere near the cathedral. Whether from divine rapture or medieval shin splints, no one knows. He was buried beneath the church, likely because the clergy couldn't just toss a Scandinavian corpse in the street. That's bad PR. But they didn't exactly roll out the sacred burial wine either. He got a low-key hole and a shrug. For centuries, people thought he'd done something disgraceful. Turns out he just believed a little too hard and had no idea how much walking was involved. Classic pilgrim behavior, the real mystery. How this guy survived all that distance on a diet of salted fish and questionable bread and still didn't get canonized? So no, he wasn't a monk. He was just extremely tired. Moral of the story: if you're going to walk across Europe for spiritual reasons, at least wear a name tag that says, not a heretic, just devoted. Once upon a time, in a land of history books and bad haircuts, there lived a king named Richard III. You may remember him as the hunchbacked villain from Shakespeare's play, the guy who shouted, a horse, my kingdom for a horse." Which, to be fair, sounds like the kind of thing you say after realizing Uber doesn't exist yet. But for centuries, Richard III's remains were missing, vanished, disappeared somewhere between the Battle of Bosworth and someone sweeping up the royal battlefield. Like, yeah, we'll just deal with this later. Well, it turns out later meant over 500 years. Enter a parking lot in Leicester. Yes, not a castle, not a crypt, not even a suspicious-looking well. Just your average boring car park behind a city council building. Apparently that's where royal dignity goes to die. In 2012, a group of very determined archaeologists armed with ground-penetrating radar, and frankly a shocking level of optimism, decided to dig up said parking lot. Why? Because some medieval records vaguely suggested that Richard was buried at the nearby Grey Friars Church, which had since been demolished, paved over, and rebranded as Parking Bay No. 7. They found a skeleton, male, late 30s, skull caved in like he'd lost a very serious argument with a sword, spine twisted like a medieval IKEA assembly gone wrong. In other words, a perfect match. DNA testing confirmed it, not with some grand royal relic, but by swabbing the cheek of a Canadian guy who turned out to be Richard's 16 times great-nephew. Imagine finding out you're related to royalty, but only because your great-great-great-granduncle got dumped under asphalt. So yes, Richard III was found under a parking lot, ending centuries of speculation and giving British tabloids the kind of pun material they hadn't seen since Henry VII's sixth wife royally parked. Anyone? The mystery of his grave solved. His reputation still complicated, but at least he's now re-airied with honor. no longer sharing his eternal rest with oil stains and gum wrappers. Discovered in 1912 by a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voyage, this mysterious medieval text has puzzled historians, cryptographers, and one very determined guy in his mom's basement for over a century. Written in a completely unknown script and language, it looked like a medieval scholar drank one too many herbal tonics and decided to invent an alphabet and a plant taxonomy, and possibly a new religion involving naked women in bathtubs. The manuscript itself is a fever dream on vellum. 240 pages of undecipherable writing, bizarre star charts, nude women floating in green goo, and plants that bot professors describe as nope, not real. It's basically what you'd get if a herbalist and an alien collaborated on a coloring book. For decades, people assumed it was a hoax, maybe a prank played on some poor medieval nobleman with more gold than brain cells. Others suggested it was a lost language, or the diary of an extremely eccentric wizard. But recently, drumroll please, artificial intelligence and linguistic analysis actually cracked parts of it. Not the whole thing, of course. That would be too satisfying, but enough to ruin some of the mystery and give the academic world a reason to high-five in Latin. Turns out the language may be a form of proto-Romance, an early offshoot of Latin that no one thought was ever written down. So basically medieval slang like finding out someone carved LOL into a monastery wall in the year 1420. Some phrases were decoded. Herbal remedies, female health tips, a medieval zodiac, which means the Voynich manuscript isn't a map to the Holy Grail or instructions for time travel. It's more like a 15th century wellness blog. Gwyneth Paltrow, but make it parchment. So yes, the mystery is kind of solved. It's not nonsense, it's just health. Advice written in a dying dialect, illustrated by someone who clearly had very specific feelings about bathtubs. The real question is who wrote it? Why? And did they ever imagine people in the year 2024 would still be squinting at their herbal doodles like it held the secrets to the universe? Probably not. But hey, at least we know it wasn't just medieval gibberish. It was meaningful medieval gibberish. Somewhere in 12th century, Suffolk, in a sleepy little village called Woolpit, which sounds like either a charming English hamlet or an aggressive sheep trap, two children appeared out of nowhere. And we mean nowhere. They just kind of showed up. No parents, no explanation, no TikTok announcement. But the real kicker, they were green. Not metaphorically green like new to the job, but actually botanically green like salad, or someone who took the phrase "you are what you eat" far too literally. According to the chroniclers, and medieval chroniclers never exaggerated, obviously these children spoke no known language, wore weird clothes, and looked like they had just escaped from a very serious painting by Hieronymus Bosch. Naturally, the villagers did the medieval equivalent of a wellness check. They tried to feed them bread and beans. The children refused all food except raw beans, because clearly they were picky and possibly photosynthetic. Eventually, they started eating normal food, and wouldn't you know it, their green hue faded. Turns out being green might have had less to do with aliens and more to do with severe malnutrition. Because if you go long enough without eating anything but beans, apparently your body says, you know what? Let's just go chlorophyll and hope for the best. The boy sadly died soon after, not unusual for the Middle Ages, where eating a suspicious mushroom could be fatal, and so could not eating at all. But the girl survived, learned English, and spilled the metaphorical beans. They came from a place with no sun and eternal twilight, and they were hearing their father's cattle when they somehow wandered into Woolpit through a cave. Naturally, the modern explanation is that they were Flemish refugees, kids who fled political conflict, got lost, suffered dietary deficiencies, and got mistaken for forest elves. It happens, especially in England. Let's set the scene. A quiet English church, candles flickering, Latin chants echoing through the stone vaults. The priest is mid-smon, probably warning everyone about eternal damnation or the dangers of cheese on Fridays. Meanwhile, somewhere in the pews, one peasant, teenager, is etching a crude doodle of a sword fight on the wall for posterity and possibly revenge. For centuries, strange carvings inside English churches had people scratching their heads, and not just because the benches were made of splintered oak. These symbols were long thought to be protective marks against demons, you know, witches' traps, hex wards, circles to confuse evil spirits who apparently failed geometry. Some of the marks do look ominous. Interlocking circles, stars, odd runes, daisy wheels. Yes, daisy wheels, that terrifying flower of doom. Victorian scholars got very excited about these and decided that obviously medieval people were constantly terrified of being dragged to hell by goat-hooved demons during Mass, which, to be fair, was probably more exciting than the actual sermon. But then came the spoil sports. Modern archaeologists with their laser scanners and rational explanations. After thoroughly documenting over 28,000 pieces of medieval graffiti, they found that shockingly many of them weren't demonic in nature at all. In fact, some were just names or drawings of ships or swords or cats. Turns out church graffiti was often done by regular parishioners, bored, devout, or both, leaving marks for reasons ranging from personal devotion to "I was here." Gerald, 1378. Some were votive symbols requesting protection or commemorating prayers. Others were probably the medieval equivalent of carving your crush's initials into a school desk. And while some symbols do have a magical bent, a few circles might be hex warding. The idea that every mark was a desperate attempt to trap Satan in a doodle is, well, optimistic at best. So the next time you wander through an ancient English church and spot a scratched outline of a medieval sword fight or someone's name in jagged lettering, just know it's not a warning of demonic infestation. It's just Gerald. Bored Gerald, who couldn't sit through another 2-hour homily without expressing himself via blunt instrument on soft limestone. In the annals of medieval mythology, Rungholt has long been whispered about like a soggy Atlantis, a wealthy city swallowed whole by the sea as punishment for its arrogance, pride, and probably subpar tithing. It was said to have sunk in a single night in 1362 during a massive storm called the Gro Mandranka, or Great Drowning of Men, which is also what happens when you try to cross a North Sea pub crawl during a storm surge. For centuries, people debated whether Rungholt even existed. Some believed it was just a fable to scare coastal villages into humility. The medieval German version of "clean your room or the sea will eat your entire town." Others insisted it was real, but had long since been lost beneath layers of silt, salt, and sheep. Legend said Rungholt was decadent. The people were wealthy, godless, and so rude they once refused lodging to a beggar priest. Naturally, God responded in classic Old Testament fashion with a flood, because nothing says divine justice like aquatic urban renewal. But modern archaeologists have recently confirmed that yes, Rungholt existed. And yes, it absolutely got wrecked by the sea. Thanks to LiDAR scans, sonar mapping, and some very muddy German researchers in galoshes, parts of Rungholt's harbour walls, drainage systems, and dikes have finally been found beneath the Woden Sea. And guess what? It turns out Rungholt wasn't a fairy tale. It was a thriving North Fian port city. The area had advanced water control systems, tons of trade, and presumably a whole lot of people who now wish they hadn't settled in a literal swamp next to the ocean. The cause of its destruction wasn't just divine wrath. It was climate change. Medieval Europe was warming. Storm surges were rising, and dike maintenance was, let's say, budget constrained. So when the 1362 storm hit, Rungholt was about as prepared as a sandcastle facing a tsunami. Ah, the Knights Templar, history's favorite combination of holy warriors, secret symbols, and conspiracy theories involving treasure, grails, and angry church officials. So when a cave in Shropshire, England was discovered, containing mysterious carvings, candle niches, and a suspicious lack of wine racks, the internet predictably exploded into Templar-confirmed mode. Enter the Caton Caves, a sandstone network beneath a farmer's field that looks like the set of a very budget medieval horror film, or possibly a dungeon escape room run by monks. With narrow passages, low ceilings, and intricately carved pillars, it didn't take long before whispers began. Templars, secret rituals, holy relics. Indiana Jones would love this. For years, rumors swirled that this cave had been used by the Knights Templar themselves after they were outlawed in the 14th century. Hidden underground, performing forbidden rites, probably whispering Latin prayers while trying not to bump their helmets on the ceiling. The dramatic lighting in photographs didn't help. The place looked like it belonged in a Dan Brown novel, or at the very least a particularly committed LRR session. But here's where the recent research comes in to ruin everyone's fun. The cave is probably not that old. Most signs point to the structure being 19th century in origin. That's right, Victorian era, which means the Templars were long gone. and the only secret society using this place may have been a group of bored gentlemen with a flair for the theatrical. There were mysterious rituals, of course. Members of fringe spiritualist groups are known to have used the cave in the 20th century, and modern-day pagans, goths, and at least one wedding photographer have all visited for the ambience. So yes, weird things happened in cave, but not the medieval kind. More the we're all wearing cloaks and chanting for no clear reason kind. And while it's technically possible the cave repurposed older sites, there's no hard evidence linking it to the actual Templars. No relics, no inscriptions, not even a good old-fashioned sword stuck in a stone. Ah yes, the princes in the tower, a mystery so famous it has its own genre of historical finger-pointing. In the summer of 1483, two royal brothers, Edward Fife and Richard, of Shrewsbury, aged 12 and 9 respectively, vanished from the Tower of London. And not in the got bored and wandered off kind of way, more the likely murdered by political ambition, wearing a fancy doublet sort of vibe. For centuries, everyone had a favorite suspect. Richard III, their charmingly hunchbacked uncle, topped the charts as the likely culprit. After all, he was the one who locked them up for their protection and then mysteriously became king, which is always a suspicious career move. But then you've got Henry Zemdal, who defeated Richard and married the prince's sister, conveniently uniting the family line and ensuring that if anyone asked too many questions, there were no royal nephews left to challenge him. He also may have quietly disposed of the bodies, because why let your rival keep the murder spotlight? Now fast forward to 1674, when workers at the tower dug up a wooden box under a staircase. Inside, two small skeletons, suspiciously child-sized and conveniently unaccompanied by any context or helpful post-it notes. Charles II, never one to overthink things, declared, "These must be the princes," and had them rearied in Westminster Abbey like royal lost luggage. But here's the kicker. Those bones have never been definitively identified. No carbon dating, no DNA testing, just royal vibes and a suspicious staircase. Until now, well, almost. Recent pressure from historians and scientists has pushed the Crown and the Church of England to consider DNA testing the bones, possibly comparing them to known royal descendants. In theory, we could now tell whether the bones belong to the two York princes or some poor, unrelated medieval kids who got the short end of the architectural renovation stick. The mystery, however, remains unresolved, just barely. The tools are ready, the science is there. The permissions are very British and delayed. But for the first time, we're on the verge of a scientific resolution to a murder mystery, older than most castles. Let's set the scene. Strasbourg, Holy Roman Empire, 1518. A woman named Freofa walks into the street and starts dancing. Not fun dancing, not festival dancing, not even wine and regret dancing. No, she danced like her life depended on it, because according to some witnesses, it might have. Within a week, dozens joined her. Within a month, reports say up to 400 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others suffered strokes, heart attacks, and in at least a few cases danced themselves to death. Historians call it the dancing plague, which sounds like a rejected Eurovision entry. But the sources are surprisingly consistent. It wasn't a party. It wasn't a flash mob. It was a bizarre, involuntary mass event that left people in serious medical distress. Naturally, the medieval authorities did the logical thing. They built a stage and hired musicians, because if people are dying from dancing, clearly what they need is a better beat and more cowbell. That'll fix it. But what was this strange epidemic of boogieing doom? For centuries, people guessed wildly. Some said demonic possession. Others blamed hot blood because medieval medicine had all the scientific rigor of a horoscope. One theory even involved spider bites, which to be fair would make me dance too. Today, however, modern scholars lean toward two more plausible explanations: mass psychogenic illness and ergot poisoning. Mass psychogenic illness, as known as group hysteria, can happen in communities under extreme stress, and Strasbourg in famine, plague, political instability, and all the makings of a society wound tighter than a lute string. Basically, these folks needed therapy and bread, not a stage show. The other theory is ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and produces LSD-like hallucinations. It's the same culprit often blamed for the Salem witch trials. So yes, it's possible these people were tripping hard, and instead of seeing demons, they just felt the irresistible need to groove. Recent re-evaluations of the event suggest a mix of trauma, malnutrition, religious fervor, and possibly toxic bread. A recipe for either a trance state or a medieval EDM festival gone very wrong. Let's talk about a teenage king with leprosy who outlived most of his enemies, ruled with surprising competence, and died young enough to make a rock band jealous. Welcome to the baffling, tragic, and surprisingly dignified story of Baldwin IV, as known as the Leper King of Jerusalem. When Baldwin was diagnosed with leprosy as a boy, everyone assumed he'd die, quickly and quietly, preferably off stage and with a generic footnote in history. Instead, he became king at 13, led armies into battle, outsmarted Saladin, and ruled for over a decade with leprosy in the 12th century. While everyone around him was busy dying of paper cuts and suspicious cheese, the question that's puzzled historians is, what kind of leprosy did he actually have? Was it really the disfiguring, slow, burning disease we picture from medieval art, or was it something else? Something exaggerated for political drama, like medieval PR spin. Recent studies suggest Baldwin may have had tuberculoid leprosy, a milder form of Hansen's disease that affects nerves and skin, but doesn't necessarily lead to the full melting face aesthetic. In fact, chronic nerve damage and muscle atrophy could explain why he slowly lost the ability to use his arms and legs, but kept his mind razor sharp. There's also a theory he might have had another neurological disease entirely, something like Shakemurray tooth disease, which also causes muscle weakness, limb deformities, and numbness. If true, it would mean that for centuries people just pointed at a sick teen and yelled, "Leper," the way we now blame Mercury in retrograde. Contemporary accounts describe Baldwin as physically deteriorating, but mentally sharp until the end. He fought battles, arranged diplomatic marriages, and even appointed his own successor, all while being unable to hold a sword or mount a horse without assistance. So, what really killed him? Most likely complications from progressive nerve degeneration, infections, and medieval medicines just throw herbs at it approach. He died at 24, which for someone managing a crumbling kingdom and his own body falling apart was frankly a miracle. So yes, we've mostly solved the mystery. He wasn't a zombie king or a holy miracle. He was just a deeply unlucky but politically competent teenager in a brutal world. And if that's not the most medieval job description ever, I don't know what is. Somewhere in medieval Europe, a convent cemetery was being excavated by modern archaeologists expecting the usual bones, rosary beads, and maybe a humble shoe buckle or two. Instead, what they found was a female skeleton, buried in a religious habit, clearly a nun, whose grave contained not one but two skeletons, hers, and that of a newborn infant nestled against her ribs. Well, that's awkward. Naturally, this sent scholars spiraling into speculation. Had she been the victim of assault? Was it a secret affair with a priest? Did the cloistered garden have more than just apples growing in secret? Enter ancient DNA testing, the 21st century equivalent of medieval confession, only less forgiving. Genetic analysis confirmed the infant was biologically her child. No more. Maybe the Virgin Mary sent a miracle theories. This nun had very much broken the vow of chastity, and not with subtlety. Now, to be fair, childbirth in a convent wasn't entirely unheard of. Medieval records are full of monastic scandals, most of which were buried along with the evidence. But finding actual remains, that's rare. So the mystery then became, what happened to her? And why wasn't she punished or excommunicated? Well, the burial told us more than a trial record ever could. She was buried with full religious rites, suggesting the convent forgave her, or more likely tried to keep things very quiet. Medieval monastic communities were self-governing, and it wasn't uncommon to handle things internally, especially if a scandal might attract attention. From the bishop, or heaven forbid, Rome. Was the child's father a passing knight, a local farmand, or a particularly persuasive abbot? That part remains unsolved. But one theory suggests rape or coercion may have played a role based on pelvic trauma, though others argue it could simply reflect complications from childbirth. As with all things medieval, the truth is foggy, sad, and smells faintly of incense. What we do know is this. A nun gave birth in secret, died during labor, and was quietly laid to rest. child in arms, habits intact. And centuries later, DNA analysis pulled her secret back into the light, leaving modern researchers red-faced and medieval ones spinning in their graves. For decades, a bizarre skull found in a medieval European grave had people whispering about aliens, mutants, or possibly a very avant-garde helmet experiment gone wrong. Elongated cranium, weird proportions, haunting sockets, the whole package. If you stumbled across it on a late-night documentary, you'd expect a narrator saying, "Could this be evidence of extraterrestrial visitors?" Short answer, no. Slightly longer answer, someone's mom had very ambitious aesthetic goals for her baby. The skull in question had been intentionally cranially deformed, a process where an infant's head is bound with cloth boards or little wooden hats to mold it into a specific shape over time. And yes, this was totally normal in some medieval cultures, especially among nomadic tribes or fringe aristocrats who wanted their children to grow up with regal vibes and a forehead that could double as a battering ram. The practice dates back thousands of years and isn't unique to medieval Europe. But what made this particular skull famous was the extreme degree of elongation, the eerie preservation, and let's be honest, our modern obsession with aliens and body horror. It didn't help that for years, the skull was housed in a local museum's mystery cabinet, right next to a mummified hand and a taxidermy fox with two heads. Recent advances in forensic anthropology and DNA analysis finally put the mystery to rest. Scientists confirmed the skull belonged to a woman, probably high status, likely part of the Huns or another steppe group migrating through Europe during the early medieval period. In other words, no UFO, no curse, no alien baby, just an extremely committed mom and a very cooperative baby. The intention wasn't to make them look strange but beautiful, according to the standards of the time. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of braces, Botox, and a TikTok filter, all applied before your first birthday. And lest you scoff, remember that modern humans still engage in voluntary aesthetic torture. High heels, corsets, eyebrow threading. At least medieval skull shaping came with lifetime results. No maintenance required. So, picture this. Some kid in England is skipping rocks across a lake, probably pretending he's in a video game or being mildly medieval, when suddenly clunk, his rock hits something. Not a frog, not a boot, a full-blown sword. And just like that, every local news anchor dusted off their Excalibur puns and gave the story more airtime than municipal elections. To be clear, this wasn't King Arthur's sword. That one was allegedly tossed into the lake by Sir Bedivere, and a mysterious hand emerged to catch it, which was a totally reasonable plot point in a time when people believed in dragons and taxes from the church. But back to reality, what the girl found was an actual medieval sword buried in the lake bed for hundreds of years. It was long, rusted, and most suspiciously perfectly shaped, like the kind you'd use to defend a muddy castle from Vikings, or to enforce questionable feudal land disputes. Archaeologists stepped in, excited to date the blade and explain its presence in the water. And no, it wasn't Excalibur, but it was a genuine 9th to 11th century weapon, likely of Anglo-Saxon origin. So what was it doing at the bottom of a lake? Here's where things get squishy. One theory, ritual deposition. The practice of throwing valuable items into lakes or rivers as offerings to gods or spirits. Think of it as medieval Amazon returns, except the recipient is a deity who lives in algae. Another possibility, panic dump. Imagine a knight running from battle, realizes he's about to be arrested or robbed, and flings the sword into the lake with the enthusiasm of someone ditching a phone before it incriminates them. Or, and this is the most likely accidental loss, medieval people fished, washed clothes, and sometimes fought near lakes. If you've ever dropped your phone in a toilet, you understand how easy it is to lose something valuable to water. Somewhere in the English countryside, tucked between sheep pastures and pubs with names like the Drunken Duck, stand a group of ancient stones ominously named the Whispering Knights. They're part of the larger Rolite-Wright Stones complex, a prehistoric circle of megaliths that looked like a druid's IKEA set, long abandoned mid-assembly. Now, the knights aren't exactly knight-shaped. They're 5 tall, jagged stones leaning in towards each other, like they're gossiping at the medieval office water cooler. For centuries, locals believed these stones whispered secrets to each other, especially on moonlit nights or when you turned your back on them like a complete idiot in a horror movie. Folklore insisted they were cursed, knights turned to stone for trying to overthrow a king. Naturally, because in medieval Britain, if you so much as jaywalked, someone declared you a statue by divine punishment. The tale was charming until scientists showed up and with the finesse of a buzzkill in a fairy tale said, "Let's study the geology." So what did modern analysis reveal? First off, the stones weren't knights. They were just Neolithic, dating back to 3500 BCE, long before chainmail and grail quests. They're aligned in a way that suggests ritual purpose, possibly astronomical like so many other megalithic sites. Basically, Neolithic people loved big rocks and pointing them at the stars, as one does. But what about the whispering? Here's where things get fun. Acoustic tests found that sound does behave strangely around the stones. Their shape and position create localized echo chambers, meaning whispers spoken in certain directions bounce and carry in unexpected ways. In a pre-science world, this naturally meant witchcraft, curses, or that the rocks were gossiping about your haircut. So while they're not knights, and they're not whispering, juicy medieval secrets, they do serve as proof that our ancestors were deeply fascinated with space, sound, and probably freaking out visitors. Today, the whispering knights still lean in like they're sharing the latest scandal. And to be fair, if you've stood next to a mildly suspicious group at a party, you know how unsettling that body language can be. Are they haunted? Probably not. But acoustically suspicious? Absolutely. In medieval Europe, if your body refused to decompose properly after death, you had two career options: saint or supernatural menace. There was no third path. If the local priest liked you, congratulations, you were a holy miracle and possibly getting your own stained glass window. If not, get ready for an exhumation and a wooden stake through the ribcage. For centuries, tales circulated of corpses that just wouldn't rot. Monks, nobles, even ordinary townsfolk occasionally made headlines, parchment margins, for staying suspiciously well preserved. The living, naturally terrified of being haunted, blamed the usual suspects: sorcery, demonic possession, or just bad vibes. One particularly strange case took place in a small monastery in Eastern Europe. A nun, quiet, pious, and aggressively average in life, was buried during winter. But when her remains were moved months later, her body was found completely intact. Cue whispers of sainthood, candlelight vigils, and at least one terrified kitchen boy fainting on the spot. Fast forward to modern times, and enter science with its usual party crashing. Facts. Researchers recently analyzed several preserved medieval corpses using high-tech methods such as DNA sequencing, forensic chemistry, and most thrilling of all, fungal swabbing. What they found was far less mystical and far more microbiological. Turns out, under the right conditions, a body can dehydrate rapidly, especially in cold, dry crypts, which essentially mummifies the remains. This natural preservation, called saponification, in some cases where fat turns into a waxy soap-like substance, can happen without any embalming curses or divine intervention. Just good old physics and fungi. As for our holy nun, she was buried during a harsh winter in a particularly airy stone crypt with lime-act soil, nature's walk-in freezer. No demons, no miracles, just a medieval version of vacuum sealing leftovers. The best part, while the village once lit candles in her honor, modern analysis revealed her diet consisted almost entirely of pickled fish and rye porridge. So, not exactly the stuff of sainthood, but her story reminds us how easily the line between miracle and microbiology gets blurred, especially when people are bored, scared, and living in a time when leeches were considered advanced medicine. When people think of Victorian crime-solving, the image that often comes to mind is a man in a bowler hat, coat collar turned up, magnifying glass in hand, prowling the foggy streets of London. While fiction gave us Sherlock Holmes, reality gave us Scotland Yard. The Metropolitan Police was founded in 1829 by then Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, but it wasn't long before a special branch of detectives was needed. Ordinary constables could keep the peace, but London was swelling into a metropolis of millions, and with it came daring jewel heists, fraud schemes, and brutal murders. These were crimes too complex for a nightstick and a lantern. In 1842, a small detective branch was created at Scotland Yard. just 8 plainclothes officers who were not easily trusted. To the Victorian public, detectives seemed almost criminal themselves. They didn't wear uniforms. They snooped around in taverns and they infiltrated gangs by disguising themselves. Newspapers sneered at them as spies and slinkers in the shadows. Respectable citizens worried that detectives blurred the line between lawman and lawbreaker. And yet, when a crime truly baffled the public, everyone turned to Scotland Yard. The early detectives had to prove their worth by solving cases that ordinary policing couldn't touch. They pursued master thieves who specialized in safe cracking and art theft, tracked down notorious swindlers who preyed on the gullible with elaborate cons, and even uncovered political conspiracies during a time when fears of revolution simmered across Europe. They were in effect pioneers of professional detective work in Britain, though their methods were a mixture of instinct, street smarts, and slowly emerging science. What made Scotland Yard's detective branch remarkable was its transformation from a distrusted experiment to a symbol of authority. By the 1860s and 70s, the Yardmen were appearing in courtrooms with evidence that carried more weight than mere rumor. Their work shaped the public's idea of what a detective should be. Methodical, sharp-eyed, and unyielding, the Yard's reputation was cemented by high-profile cases like the pursuit of the Garers, who strangled victims in dark alleys, or the hunt for conmen who impersonated aristocrats to rob banks. Though they began in suspicion, Scotland Yard detectives became indispensable. By the late Victorian era, they were not just men in plain clothes. They were the very embodiment of a new age of crime-solving, where deduction and investigation mattered more than luck and chance. In early Victorian England, murder investigations were often little more than guesswork. A coroner might inspect a body quickly, listen to a few witness statements, and declare a cause of death that satisfied the jury. But as the century unfolded, a revolution began in the morgue. Doctors started to see the corpse not just as a shell of the deceased, but as a book of evidence waiting to be read. This shift marked the birth of forensic autopsies, a practice that would forever change the way crimes were solved. The idea was simple, yet groundbreaking. The body itself could testify. Physicians began cutting open stomachs to search for poison, analyzing bruises to determine whether injuries were inflicted before or after death, and studying blood patterns to reconstruct the final moments of violence. These practices weren't just grisly rituals, they were the beginnings of a new science. Toxicology emerged as one of the most important fields. Arsenic, known as the inheritance powder for its popularity among would-be heirs, was suddenly detectable through chemical testing. For the first time, a murderer could be undone not by confession or rumor, but by science. The public followed these developments with a mix of fascination and horror. Courtrooms buzzed with excitement when medical experts delivered their findings, brandishing vials and describing chemical reactions that revealed invisible poisons. Newspapers eagerly reported on such cases, turning scientific testimony into a kind of theater. Suddenly, the grim business of dissection became part of everyday conversation. People realized that crimes once thought unsolvable could now be proven with evidence that could not lie. But the new methods were not without controversy. Many Victorians were deeply uneasy about the desecration of the body, still holding religious or superstitious fears about dissection. Others questioned the reliability of doctors. Could a man in a lab coat truly be more trustworthy than an eyewitness? Mistakes did happen. In some trials, expert witnesses contradicted one another, confusing juries and feeding skepticism. Yet despite resistance, forensic autopsies slowly gained acceptance. By the latter half of the century, they had become indispensable to criminal investigations. Inquests were no longer just community rituals of judgment. They were stages where science spoke louder than rumor. The autopsy transformed death from a mystery into a source of hard evidence. In doing so, it gave Victorian detectives a powerful ally, proof drawn not from hearsay but from the silent testimony of the dead. For most of history, proving someone's identity in a criminal case was an unreliable business. Suspects could lie, witnesses could misremember, and even photographs, though emerging in the Victorian age, were far from foolproof. A clever